6, but it's too early. So, but the 645 million is at 6:30, so that's why we're learning.
Is it 6:28? I think is the time. Tell us in Tefillin or something like that.
Something like that, but they're starting at 6:10.
No, I'm saying for our 6:30. If we go for 6:30, we can put them on just before we start.
Oh, I don't know.
I think it was 6:32.
6:32?
22.
22. Okay, great.
Okay. All right, let me just see where figure this out. Oh, here we are. Okay. So we're learning about the prohibition. Can everyone see the text of the Imrei Yaakov, I hope? We're learning about the prohibition of placing things on your property adjacent to the property of your neighbor that's going to cause damage to your friend's property. And the last thing that we saw in the Imrei Yaakov yesterday in Ayin Zion was this idea of creating vibrations. And the last thing that he wrote is that he foreshadowed what we're going to see in a later halacha, that if a person has a medical condition which causes him to suffer by hearing loud noises or experiencing vibrations, then he can also use that as a way of compelling his neighbor to stop the noise or the vibration. Yeah.
Canada, for example, for bylaw that have property that sitting on one side of the wall, that can on the side of the wall. There's noise laws, would this be applicable in our neighborhoods where we potentially may have Jewish and non-Jewish neighbors?
So this is the question. What course of action should you or I take if we have, obviously, if the neighbor is non-Jewish, then there's nothing that I can do. If I have a nuisance neighbor who's doing this thing, I can't show him the halacha, right? But what if my neighbor is acting this way and he's another Yid, he's another Jew?
Well, my question was really, how should we act?
Well, it's prohibited to cause damage to a non-Jew, just like it's prohibited to cause damage to a Jew. There's no distinction in halacha between causing damage to a Jew or a non-Jew. The question is there a demand for restitution when you damage a non-Jew? I believe there is. I believe that the same obligation of restitution is the same between a Jew and a non-Jew. But so, you know, the only thing that you have to bear in mind, though, is that you are compelled by a higher authority than the municipal law. You're compelled by the authority of halacha such that even if it could be argued that municipal law does not obligate you to the same degree that halacha does, you have to live by even a higher standard sometimes. Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
Something a shadow. So the shadow now is killing my grass from the shadow. So it's over.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know. We did see that causing shade or obstructing one's view is not an actionable offense in halacha. It's only if that person is, through creating an obstruction, has a new view of your property. That's what we've seen so far. We haven't seen anything about shade being a cause of damage. Now, it could be that it is. And it could be that if you made your case, we just haven't seen it yet. But we'll have to wait till we get through all of these halachas before let's just keep that in mind, okay? Of course, if you know that you're causing, that your neighbor has pride of ownership of their garden, and you do things on your property that cause that garden to wilt, right? Whether or not it's actionable or not, based on what we see in halacha, there's clearly an ethical directive, right? So have you ever tried to approach your neighbor and explain this to them? And what is their response? Uh-huh. Okay. Well, it's not going to help your grass in the meantime, but I guess at least they know how you feel. You've expressed yourself. And I know that when you have a good neighbor, it's a blessing. And when you have a bad neighbor, it's a big curse, So a Shachin Tov, there's one opinion in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that a Shachin Tov is the best thing that you can possibly be. Shachin meaning a neighbor. Because you see how we are directly impacted. Our quality of life is directly impacted by the neighbors that we have around us, especially today when we live in such close proximity. And I'm not so sure in the times of when that Mishnah was written that people lived in such close proximity to each other, but that's certainly true today. Okay, so we're up to Ayin Ches, Zevel Umelach V'chulei. That you're not allowed to place either fertilizer, dung, salt, lime, things that are going to cause corrosion. He says, "Umuter lasos b'chol nezikin elu b'shalo kishe'ein shem davar hanizok she'ein sham davar hanizok adayin dahainu she'ein sham hakotel." Now, what you would be allowed to do is place corrosive materials on your property if the wall has not yet been built. In other words, you can go up to your property line, put corrosive materials there, such that if there were a wall, you'd have to distance your materials from the wall. But since there's no wall there, you're permitted to put your stuff there. And because you were there first, so to speak, with your corrosive materials, if your neighbor does choose to build a wall at some later point, you're not obligated to distance your corrosive materials. Some disagree with that. Some say that the moment your neighbor builds the wall, you have to distance your corrosive materials. Bikol makom, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to function with listening to myself in an echo. Okay. Bikol makom, yochol lomar kimli kedas hamatirim. He says, but a person could say that there are two opinions regarding this halacha. And whenever there's a two different opinions on a monetary law, the party who is accused of causing the damage can always say, I paskin like the other opinion, and so you're sort of at a disadvantage. The dafka be'elu, but only when it comes to corrosive materials is there such a controversy. Aval be'ashan v'reach beit hakisei v'avak v'chayotze bo v'nidnut karka, he says, but when it comes to more blatant violations of neighbor law, and he's quoting the Nesivos HaMishpat over here, such as when there's smoke emanating from your property and your neighbor hasn't yet moved into the vacant house, okay? Or reach beit hakisei, let's say you set up an outhouse adjacent to your neighbor's property and he hasn't moved in yet, so no one's there to smell the offensive odor, but now that someone's moving in, he says, I don't want to live right next to an outhouse, especially when the wind is in my direction. He says he has a right to stop you. The avak, or dust, the chayot sebo, or other kinds of things that clearly waft over to the other guy's property, or v'nidnud karka, or vibration of the soil. Sarich laharchik. Then in that case, even if your neighbor comes after you've begun that activity, you would still be obligated to distance yourself at the order of your neighbor. V'lo moil ma shesamach kodem shevalo sham davar hanizak. It doesn't matter. It makes no difference that you started first. It doesn't make a difference. Mihu im zachu shnehem b'shel hefker kol hakodem zacha ve'ein hasheni haba acharav yachal limchos bo. But that's when a person purchases property. What if two people acquire property from no man's land? They get it from Hefker. Let's say it's the Wild West, right? And two people are traveling and they find this piece of property. This is not a real life situation because all real estate in the modern world is owned by somebody. It's either owned by the government or it's owned by a private individual. But in times when there was such a thing called Hefker real estate, then this halacha would not apply. Whoever gets there first can do whatever they want. And if you acquire a piece of a forest after me, and you're not happy that I've started a factory on my piece of the forest, it's too bad for you. I was here first, and it's hefker. Okay? Okay. Now, next. We have to distance. How much do you have to distance from the wall when you have corrosive material? Laharchik mimenu gimel tfachim. Next halacha is you have to distance 3 tvachim. B'chol hezekot shelo nitboaru shir harchakatan, tzarech laharchak b'chdei shelo yazik lefi ra'os habekiim. He says, in any situation where the amount is not specified explicitly in the Talmud, as far as how much you have to distance, then the distance amount is determined by experts. In other words, you ask an engineer or a materials engineer who knows what materials are corrosive, have a corrosive effect on other materials, and they will tell you you'd have to distance this much, or perhaps there would be a municipal code that would indicate how much you have to distance. That's what you would use in any kind of situation where, and I'm sure there must be bylaws for these things, I would imagine. Setbacks, right, and things like that. Umikol makom, af im hirchik kedin, im yatsa mizen nezek chayev l'shalim, ela shechachamim lo hiskiku laharchik ela lefima sheragil lahazik. And this is a very important line. It basically states that you have to distance yourself such that you have properly estimated that at this distance, you don't anticipate damage being caused by your corrosive material. But let's say, as a result of wind or result of rain and things like that, your corrosive materials end up seeping into your friend's wall, and they end up damaging it anyway, and you distance yourself the amount that you thought was appropriate. You still have to pay. In other words, if you end up damaging the wall, even though you've properly distanced, but clearly the forensics indicate that the damage was caused to the wall because of your corrosive material, then according to halacha, you still have to pay for that. Okay? It's just a question of what is my halachic obligation of distancing to prevent damage, right? But even when I've done that, if it's clear from forensic examination that the wall crumbled exactly where in the area of where that material is, so then I have to compensate for it. Okay, is that clear? Make sure. Okay. Let's see. And this is really what the subject of this Biurim is, but let me just see if there's more Imrei Yaakov over here. Let's finish the Imrei Yaakov first. Let me make sure we finished it. Yeah, we finished the Imrei Yaakov. And so let me just do some more of the Likutim, then we'll come back to the okay. So in the previous Likutim, we had discussed the issue of playing a practical joke and embarrassing someone or taking away their opportunity to do a mitzvah. So that had all, we took a look at that at the beginning of the Sif. In Chaf Hey, in the Likutim, he says as follows: you're not allowed to do anything that will cause damage to your fellow's property. Mishi yatsa berichbo lahatzila tanefesh, v'hizik chavero toch kedei nesiato. A person goes out, drives a car to save a life. He's an ambulance driver, or he's a Hatzalah driver. And in the course of his driving to save someone else's life, he ends up damaging someone. He hits a pedestrian, or he hits another car. So this halacha will be taken up in the Biurim when we get to Sif Chaf Beis. We're now in Sif Yudalid. When we get to Sif Chaf Beis, we're going to take a look at that halacha. Next, Reuven shehishkia mamon v'hadfasat sefer eitzel Shimon. So Reuven invested money to print the book. The name of the publisher was the Shimon Publishing House. So Reuven goes to Shimon to publish his book. Shimon does all of the typesetting, and Reuven pays him to do all of the typesetting. The Shimon wrote, and of course, this is before the advent of computers, okay? The Shimon wrote, "Achar kach lihishtamesh im haotiot shesider avor Reuven," and Shimon now wants to use the typeset letters that Reuven paid for him to typeset. Perhaps, well, we'll see the illustration. Tzorech shalem leReuven kol ma shenehener misidur haotiot. He will have to pay to Reuven back his benefit from his own typesetting work. In other words, if you compensate me for doing work for you, and now I give you the work product, but I want to benefit from that work product as well. Let's say you hired me to publish a commentary on the Chumash. And so I beautifully typeset, the Chumash with Rashi and then your commentary. And you want to take the top part of the typeset letters, Chumash and Rashi, and now you want to put a different commentary on. So, so you have to compensate the person who paid you for, prorated whatever the cost was for that top part of the page, because he paid for it. He already paid you for that work product, and if you want to benefit from that work product again, you'd have to pay the owner of that work product now for the ability to use that. I'm not really sure I understand what this is doing in this particular area of the halacha, because doesn't have anything to do with damages. It's got to do with financial obligations of benefiting from someone else's property. But be that as it may, it probably appears in some response in relation to this halacha. Next, Yecholim hashechenim la'akev shelo ya'aseh chatzero pundak. So let's say this has to do with zoning laws. A guy that lives in the same courtyard as a few other neighbors, and he wants to open up a hotel, okay, or an Airbnb, I guess. This has been in the news most recently because of Airbnb, where people turn their homes into a bed and breakfast, and there are people that come in and out. Now, this could create a nuisance potentially, especially if you live in a vacation area and the neighbors are used to. Let's say you live in it's not so prevalent here in Canada, in Toronto, but let's say you live on a beachfront property in Florida, okay? and it's a nice suburban, quiet neighborhood, and you decide you're going to capitalize on the times that you're not in your beachfront property by renting it out to people who come for spring break, for students who come for spring break to come to Florida. Okay, so you know what happens at spring break? They act like wilde chayas, right? So the question is, the neighbors want to prevent you from opening up that Airbnb. You argue it's within your legal rights. Airbnb allows you to do it. The government doesn't want to stop you. And now the question is, you're a from a yid, and you want to do the right thing by halacha. The other neighbors are they want to prevent you from having these kids come. They're going to be having barbecues and parties and loud music on Shabbos and Yontif, and it's a big nuisance to the neighbors. So what is the halacha in that situation? Okay, so Yecholim Hashchenim la'akev shelo yaseh chatzero pundak. It is within the rights of the neighbor to prevent one of their neighbors. Sorry?
The first words be'enu, doesn't be'enu mean not?
I was reading this.
Enu Yaakov.
I was reading for the previous sentence. Is Yecholim hashchenim la'akev shelo ya'aseh chatzero pundak. The neighbors can prevent. The neighbors can prevent a fellow neighbor from setting up a hotel or a motel. Ve'eno yachol lahaskiro la'ovrim v'shavim dahavalei pundak. And therefore, they can say that we don't want you to rent out your room or your condo or whatever it is to passersby, because by doing so, you're making it into a B&B, and that's making it into a pundak, which is the Aramaic word for a hotel, or an inn, really, is what you would call it. Avol yachol lahaskiro l'shana o l'chadashim. But you are allowed to rent it out for an extended period of time. In other words, if I want to rent out my condo for an extended period of time, for either month to month, or a year lease, that I am allowed to do, and my neighbors cannot say which tenants I may or may not rent it out to. The only thing that they can say they don't want is constant traffic of different people in and out of the condo. So there's a clear halachic difference, which is fascinating. A clear halachic difference between having your house set up for rent versus having it set up as an Airbnb. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And that's the reason why, is that because it's clearly more of a nuisance to the neighborhood when you have new faces and perhaps potentially dangerous people coming in and out that you don't recognize, versus having a familiar face that you know is your neighbor, right? So it makes sense. There's a certain logic behind it, right? Gam ma'akdim alav hashchenim shelo yaskir chatzero l'shachein ra v'kol shekein la'akom. And it's also possible that the neighbors can prevent you from renting out your property to a bad neighbor. In other words, if there's a person who's known to be a nuisance neighbor, we're going to see this halacha. I'd love, maybe what we'll do is we will we'll expand on this halacha Mirz Hashem tomorrow. We're going to hold it here for today. Everyone have a good